Well, good evening, everyone. I decided to do something a little different tonight as far as introduction to try to smooth things out and simplify it even a little bit more. By the time I'm done teaching this, I'll finally have figured out how to teach it simply. But first thing I want to mention, the book of Revelation is really a series of 4 visions, all introduced by a statement to the effect, I was in the Spirit. And so the first vision is Jesus the high priest tending the lamps, and that's from Revelation chapter 1:10 verses 30 to chapter 3 verse 22. The second vision is a vision of Jesus, the Lamb of God, is given a 7-sealed scroll, and this takes place from Revelation chapters 4 through 16. Now this will be important in the review I'm about to do. The third vision is of the judgment of the great harlot, found in Revelation 17:1 through 21:8. And the fourth vision is of the bride of Christ, or the New Jerusalem, found in Revelation 21:9 through 22:5. The book begins with a prologue, which is an introduction, and it begins with an epilogue, which is a conclusion. And that's the basic structure and framework of the book. Now, as we go through the book itself, what we're really saying is that the book of Revelation is laid out like a temple worship service. And so what I've done is I've removed some of the ancillary things and went right to the basic skeleton of a temple worship service, and that's found on the left here. In the temple, the gates were opened, the trumpets were blown. Now, other things took place, but I'm giving you the basic skeleton. The lamps would be tended, the incense would be burned, the priest would stand on the steps after the incense was burned for the music portion of the service. The sacrifice would be placed on the altar, the music would begin, and then they would pour out a drink offering, which was a wine offering. Now, on the right here is how the order of Revelation follows that almost exactly. Now, it starts out, the gates were open, but we find that in Revelation 11:19 and Revelation 15:5, which I described as we went through that. There's a reason why this is out of order, because the gates are already open when the heavenly worship service starts. But the gates are mentioned being opened in chapters 11 through 19. And in my book, I kind of explain why that's so. The trumpet is blown. Jesus speaks in the voice of a trumpet in Revelation 1:10, declaring that the heavenly worship service has started. Because when the saints began to suffer, in Revelation 1:9, John, who's on the island of Patmos for the word of God, is in tribulation with his brethren. When that tribulation started, the heavenly worship service started. Then we see the first vision of Jesus tending the lamps, which that should be a 10 versus a 0. Revelation 1:10 through 3:22 is the first vision of Jesus as dressed as the high priest, tending the 7 lamps, which represent the 7 churches. So we see that just as in the temple, that's what happens in the book of Revelation. Then in chapter 8, we skipped here for chapters 4 and 5 because that's central, but I'll cover it in a minute. The next thing we see in the book of Revelation is the burning of the incense in chapter 8, verses 1 through 5. Then we see, after we skip a few things, we see the priests stand on the steps for the music when Jesus the Lamb stands on Mount Zion with the 144,000 of his priests. That was just like what happened in the temple every day when the priests would stand on the steps in the court of the priest, and they'd begin to play the music and sing the music songs, which were the psalms. Then after the music began, in Revelation 15:1 through 4, then the drink offering would be poured out, and that's what the 7 bowls of wrath are. They're the drink offering. Then in Revelation 17, we saw last week, in the last couple of weeks, we saw that this vision starts with a reference to one of the angels that had the 7 bowls of wrath. And so this is a literary connection by John to let us know that what's really happening in this third vision is connected to what happened in the bowls of wrath. So we're at the end of the worship service. Then in Revelation 21:9, the same thing happens where the angel mentions, the scriptures mention the angel that had been part of the 7 bowls of wrath. And so this is letting us know that this is still connected to the flow of worship. Now when you look at this basic structure, and this is very basic, there's no doubt that this is what John had in mind when he was penning the book of Revelation. There's no doubt in my mind. In fact, when you read, no matter what view of Revelation you take, most writers are not going to take contention with that. They're not going to take argument with that, okay? Now, the first vision follows. Now, here's my point. The book of Revelation, because this is a big thing when you read different books. People will jump around and say, this took place then, and this took place then. And anybody read a book where you're kind of confused on what happens when? You know, because they're picking and choosing as they go. My contention is this, that the book of Revelation progresses in a linear or chronological fashion. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Not 1, 7, 10, 16, 25. Now, this is where I depart from some writers. Okay? Is because it's following a temple worship service, the structure of a revelation is A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And that's what I mean by a linear progression. It's in order. It's in order of a temple worship service. The first vision, which takes place in the holy place, the temple of Jerusalem and the tabernacle, both had two places. One was the holy place where the priest went in every day. And then they had the Holy of Holies where the priest only went in once a year. In the Holy of Holies was the Ark of the Covenant. That was the only piece of furniture there. That represented the throne of God. Now, the holy place that was inside the holy place was located the table of showbread, the candlestick, and the altar of incense. And so the priest went in there every day, twice a day, to minister. The order of Revelation chapters 1 through 3 follow the order of worship exactly. Okay? Then we come to chapter 4, which is part of the second vision. The second vision is the longest one, but it has 3 interruptions. Now, I've covered interruptions before in other classes, but basically an interruption in chapter 7, 10, and 12, they're like a zoom-in lens on a camera that gives you an expanded vision of things that were covered previously. And so it's kind of like taking a look in, like with a telescope or binoculars or a camera. And so they interrupt the flow of worship, but my point I want you to see is that the book is still continuing in order. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, skip 8, 9, 10, skip 11, 12, 13. Okay? So in chapter 4 and 5, Jesus moves from the holy place, tending the lamps in chapter 4. John is taken up into heaven, and he sees Jesus in the Holy of Holies at the ark, or the throne of God, receive a 7-sealed scroll from the Father on the throne. Chapter 6, Jesus opens the first 6 seals. Notice how Revelation chapter 6 ends with the opening of the 6th seal in Revelation 6:12, and it begins again in Revelation 8:1 with the opening of the 7th seal. In between there's chapter 7, which is an interruption. It's obvious that it's an interruption. They call them parentheticals. That's the technical term. But I use the word interruption because we get an interruption. Parenthetical sounds too English, like I'm in English class. Then we pick it back up, and the 7th seal is opened. And inside the 7 seals is contained 7 trumpets. The first 6 are opened in chapters 8, 6 through chapter 9, 21. Then we have a second interruption. And then after the second interruption, we see the blowing of the 7th trumpet in Revelation 11:15. So you can see that the order is just progressing. Okay? Then we have the third interruption in Revelation 12 through 13, which talks about the beast and the different symbology there. And then after this interruption, we pick it up again in Revelation 14, 1 through 5, when the Lamb, Jesus, stands on Mount Zion. And this is in exact order as it would happen in a temple worship service. But now it's Jesus in heaven versus them on earth in the temple. Jesus is standing, symbolically standing on Mount Zion, and that was the sign that the music was going to begin in the temple. And this is the sign because everything left in Revelation 14, 15, and 16 are all correlate to what happened at the end of the worship service in the Temple of Jerusalem. And so it's just unfolding in natural order. Revelation chapter 14, 6 through 20, as I explained a few weeks ago or months ago, whenever it was, there's 6 pieces of the sacrifice are laid in the temple, or laid at that time are placed on the altar. We saw that Revelation 14, 6 through 20 has 6 angelic signs. Why not 7? The book of Revelation is all about 7 because 6 was the number of pieces of the sacrifice. It was cut up in 6 pieces and it's laid on the altar. And John is correlating this activity with what happened in the temple worship service. Then after the sacrifice was laid on the altar, the music, and these two events would happen simultaneously in the temple. When the drink offering, actually in the temple, when the drink offering began to be poured out, that's the offering of wine, the music would begin. So they're basically simultaneous events. However, in the book of Revelation, for literary reasons, or in other words, writing reasons, John has the music starting first in Revelation 15:1 through 4, which he talks about they sang a new song. They sang the song of Moses. So he's talking about the music. Then in Revelation 15:6 through 16:21, we see the 7 bowls of wrath, which are the drink offering. They're offered. So that brings the second vision to a conclusion. But I want you to know from the first vision to the beginning, and then you see the second vision, and it's continuing in chronological order. There's 3 interruptions, which I already discussed. The third vision, which is in Revelation 17:1 through 21:8, begins with the angel that is one of the 7 that had the bowls of wrath. We also see in Revelation 17:5 and in Revelation chapter 18 that the focus of this third vision is the city of Babylon. We see in the last bowl of Revelation, turn with me there just so you can see this, Revelation chapter 16, 18, and 19, verse 19 specifically, we see that the focus of the 7th bowl is great Babylon was remembered before God to give her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. So we see that great Babylon is the focus. We see that wine is the reference, which connects this to the drink offering, which connects us to the seven bowls of wrath. And what that means is that this third vision is an expansion of the 7th bowl, which is at the end of the worship service. So in other words, we're coming to the end of the worship service. Then, after this vision, which we're still, and I'm taking way too long to cover, the fourth vision, at least in my understanding right now, it's interesting because even as I'm writing this stuff down, I'm still learning stuff, okay? Because you never stop learning. Right now, my perspective is this, unless I read something that changes my mind between now and 6 years from now when I get done chapter 17, is that the fourth vision is really the result of what happens as a result of the worship service. Because the saints of God, the bride makes herself ready in the third vision, the result is we see the New Jerusalem, which is the church, coming down from heaven. Got it? So this is kind of like the result. Now what I think I'm going to do here is I think I'm not going to cover the fourth vision this year. Is because I really want to drill down and do some more research. Because I'm still not quite sure what I even believe about some of the symbols. And I figure why not just wait and get it fresh, and that way I can revisit it. Catch you all out again, because review is the key to learning, okay? That's why I start with review every time, because I want to make sure that we're getting this in our heads, the order of worship based on a temple worship service. And once you get that structure in mind, it really becomes part of you, and that imagery really begins to get real to you. The book of Revelation is no longer scary, and it's no longer weird, and it really begins to have a comprehensive or a contextual meaning that you can begin to hang on. It has a skeleton that you can hang what you're reading on and kind of make sense of it. And that's been my problem for years in studying the book of Revelation. It seemed to have no skeleton. I'd read, Hal Lindsey, and I'd say, Hal, that sounds good that these things are helicopters and things like that, but how do you know that? And how do you get that out of that verse? And where does that fit with these other things or some of the other writers? And, I've studied the Bible since I was 14 years of age, and I'm like, I can't make sense of this. But what this begins to do is gives us a framework to see how the book is really laid out, and it really begins to help you put things in perspective. Doesn't mean you're going to come up with the same conclusions that I come up with, but it does begin to help us frame what we're reading. So that brings us into chapter 17, which we began last week. Any questions on that before I move on? We good?
Bob, do you have a piece of paper where those last few slides are?
I don't, but I can have them printed out for you next week.
That would be very helpful.
Okay? Patty, would you make a note of that? Thank you, dear.
Do you know which pages?
It would be the slides. If you just remind me of the slides that I printed up today, made up today, to simplify things, I'll be able to direct you accordingly. Okay, any other questions? That's a good question. What I'm really trying to do now is as I go through this material, I've been saturated in it, and so some of these things are just so familiar to me. I got to remember that every piece of detail that I add is just one other thing to confuse you. And so I'm trying to bring it down to the bare, because if you can get the concept of what I'm saying, you can go back and learn the details. Once you get the concept, begin to realize, this concept is really accurate. It really does work. And you can go with it wherever you want and then determine how much detail you want. Last week we started in chapter 17, the beginning of this third vision, and we've talked about the book. Chapter 17 reveals 5 mysteries. And the word mystery, mysterion, from the Greek means something that is hidden to the uninitiated or the untrained eye, but to the trained eye, to the initiated, because it comes from the mystery religions of the day, that they would understand it. So it's something that was hidden but now revealed. And so we should expect to understand what he's saying. It's not a mystery in the sense that you can't understand it. John understood what he's talking about. It's just like I was reading today an illustration, like a symphony too, but symphony. A conductor, when he's leading a symphony, he can hear every instrument, he can hear every sound, he can hear every note, but he's trained. You and I, we kind of just hear it all together, don't we? Well, that's what he's meaning here by the word mystery. To the trained, to the initiated, to those who have been let in on the secret, they can know the meaning of this mystery. But to everybody else, it's still a mystery. And you got to understand, John's writing in a time of persecution. The book of Revelation was an illegal document. It was a treasonous document. It actually had the gall to suggest that Caesar was not Lord. The one thing that Rome did not tolerate was challenging the authority of Rome and Caesar. And so this would have been an illegal document. If you got caught with this, you'd be put in jail for it. Okay? And so there's a lot of symbols for that reason, or at least I think that's why. Now, we learned 5 mysteries. We looked at the first one last week. We see there's a harlot riding a scarlet-colored beast. This beast has 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, we said that the identity of the harlot is contested. And there's people that believe it's Rome. Some people believe the harlot is Jerusalem. Some people believe it's the common market today, or in the future it's going to be some kind of system in the future. I personally believe that the harlot is Jerusalem. And I made my case. I make my case in my book. For $9.99 you can have the book. For $29.99 you can have the book. I believe it's Jerusalem. I made my case a while ago. If you have things I haven't seen, please let me know. But the identity of the beast, however, which there's a tendency, and you asked a good question last week, and I haven't had time to look into it, is a lot of people seem to me that put these two symbols together, but the identity of the woman is different than the identity of the beast. The woman rides the beast. Now, some people say this is Rome, this is the Roman Empire. I believe this is Jerusalem, which is clearly seen in the Gospels, and then this beast is the Roman Empire in its wholeness. The 7 heads are the first 7 Caesars, which the Scripture says were 7 mountains. If you turn to Revelation chapter 17, verse 9, actually. Here is the mind that has wisdom. Now, when he says, here is the mind that has wisdom, what's he implying there? Yes?
So you're on the paper that you're still on.
I'm still on the original paper. Yes.
If you weren't here 2 weeks ago, you might want the paper.
Anybody not here too that doesn't have this paper?
Yeah.
I wasn't, but you gave it to me
I
last.
did.
Okay.
Were you here? Have you been here yet this season?
Right here, Patty.
So you have it.
Right here. Anybody else need the sheet? Like I said, I've been going really slow, but that's okay because why be in a hurry now? Right? Possibly if you stretch this out long enough, Jesus will have returned and you'll know all the answers.
Amen.
Okay, and you can straighten me out. Pastor Bob, I knew you were off, but you were really off. Here's the mind has wisdom. So when he says here's the mind has wisdom, what's he implying? That you can what? You can know, you can understand. He's saying to his readers, hey, this is tough, but you can understand this if you have wisdom. He says, the 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits. There are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come, and when he comes, he must continue for a short time. So we have 7, and last week, because I ate too much sugar, I did this illustration, I couldn't make it work in my own head. But I'm not on sugar tonight. So we have 7 mountains. There's 7 kings. Now these kings are the first 7 emperors of the Roman Empire. Julius Caesar, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, and Galba. Okay? And I'm going to draw a line here, like I should have done last week. He says there are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen. What would fallen mean? They've died. So they've come and gone. 1 is, which means which king is in existence when John is writing? Nero the 6th. So John is writing somewhere before, this has to be before June 9th of 68 AD. If these kings represent who I say they are. Now that's an assumption. 1 is, and the other has not yet come, which means that Nero's still living. The next king, Galba, has not yet come, but he says, and when he comes, he must continue a short time, which Galba only lasted like 3 months. Okay? And don't hold me to that date. It's been a while since I've read this, but it's a very short time. I mean, weeks or months. Okay? The beast that was not and is, that was and is not, is himself also an 8th, and as of the 7, it is going to perdition. Now this is where I got confused last trying to explain it to you, but really what it's saying is this, that the 7th one who comes will only last a short time, but this marks the end right here of the Julio-Claudian line. The emperor in 69 AD, the empire will experience what's called by scholars the year of the 4 emperors. The Roman Empire will be thrust into civil war. The empire will have a deadly wound, which is mentioned in Revelation 13. The empire will come to the brink of collapse, and it will be Vespasian, the 10th king of the 10th Caesar, who will save the empire, start the Flavian line, of the Flavian dynasty, and he will resurrect the Roman Empire. And that happened. But he is actually the 10th, because it says, the beast that was and is not is himself also an 8th. That's referring to Vespasian, who is the 10th. Because you have the next, and I'm going to use the hills, because there are also 7 horns, or 10 horns. But I don't want to draw something different. There's 8, 9, 10. So you have Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian. So he's the 10th. But he's really the 8th because these guys weren't really emperors. They were, but they weren't. They didn't last long. They didn't have the backing of the Senate. They didn't have the backing of the people. It was just chaos. And so what he's saying in biblical terminology, he's saying, hey, this guy will last a short time, but when the next real emperor shows up, the 8th, he will resurrect. That's the secret to the 7 heads and the 10 horns. Okay? Now, I spent some time last week making a fool of myself, but basically that's where we got to last week. Any questions on that before we go further? Okay? We good? All right. Verse 11. The beast that was and is not is himself. Oh, verse 12. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have received no kingdom as yet, but they receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast. These are of one mind, or they're united, and they will give their power and authority to the beast. Now, The identity of these 10 horns now comes really into question. And I can't prove what I'm about to say beyond a shadow of a doubt. I'm just going to give you my opinion. But I'm open. If I learn something down the road, I'm very open to making an adjustment. He says the key here, he says they have received no kingdom as of yet. So what does he mean by that? Does he mean that all 10 kings are a unit that will exist as one kingdom? Or does he mean that Vespasian, which is what I believe he's saying, is that Vespasian has not received a kingdom yet, so there's not a new kingdom yet. That's how I take it to mean. But that's not like concrete. I mean, I could be wrong. Not often am I wrong, but ask my wife, it does happen. No, I'm just kidding on that. I'm really working with this. Or it could mean, as some people believe, that when John wrote this, he's talking about the coming of the Jewish war, and that at that time there were 10 kings, and 10 is symbolic just of a number, it's not exact, that united with Vespasian and Titus to actually destroy the city of Jerusalem. And that is very possible. I just don't have a lot of information on that right yet. Okay? And I might not for at least until I finish my doctoral degree, because I'm not going to be reading on this stuff a lot over the next few years. But I kind of lean towards it meaning he's talking about Vespasian hasn't received the kingdom yet, because when John was penning these words, Vespasian was just a general. But I like I said, I could be wrong. Or it could mean, has anybody ever heard of the 10 Roman persecutions? That for the next couple hundred years, Rome became the persecutor of the church, and that there was actually 10 Roman persecutions. How many have heard of that? Anybody? You've heard of it?
Oh, no, I thought it was the 10 Kingdoms, where it's the revived Roman Empire coming up and the first, that's what I thought you meant.
Okay, no, I'm talking about that. That is talking about the futurist, that in the future there's going to be a 10. That is a view people have, but that's a futurist view that says these 10 kings are in the future. And if you've ever studied this stuff, that the common market they thought was the beast for a while, that the Antichrist is going to come out here. That is the futurist view. But there's another view that says that these kings represent the 10 Roman persecutions. And that there was persecution to the Roman government. This is a historical kind of view, that this is what happened in history. My point being, there are several different views on who this is. What I can say concretely is that these kings were future to John. That does not make them future to us, but they are future to John.
I just have a question.
Yes.
I don't even know if I can ask it well, but it says that the beast, we were saying it was the Roman Empire, and then it says that it is also Vespasian. So the beast represents two things?
There's two aspects of the beast. There's the beast in its conglomerate as the Roman Empire, and there's the beast in the sense of the seat of the emperor. And that's what we find in Revelation chapter 13.
But they're talking about both things like in the same verse, right? As kind of separate, but they're the same.
Well, at least how I'm taking it. They may not be saying that. So remember, I'm saying...
Because I guess my question would be then, if when they say that they give the power and authority to the beast, are they giving the power and authority to Vespasian or to the whole Roman Empire? Like, are they
That's a good question. I can't answer that. My interpretation, and it's an interpretation, would be that they're going to give their power and authority to the emperor, the individual beast. Kenneth Gentry, there's a book called The Beast. Kenneth Gentry does an excellent job on this subject of talking about the beast of Revelation. It's the best material I've ever read on it. It's very clear. It's a book about 175 pages. It's not overwritten. And I think he makes the case for the dual nature. There's the generic beast, and there's a specific beast, and he deals with that in depth in his book. So
if that were answered, then you could answer the 10
you could.
were better.
You can, but here's the problem, is with some of this stuff, no matter how much you drill down, there's still going to be a matter of opinion on who this is. And that's where I think we should have respect for the different views, so that we can say, look, let's learn from each other. But it is true. If this means this means that. But then again, if you change it to this, it might mean that. But that's very astute. So where I'm at on this personally is I believe this is the past. I believe this is either Vespasian as the ruler of the new beast, which is the 8th, but he's actually a new beast, a new dynasty, or it's speaking of kings that gathered, because I do believe that the text is clear that this has happened. Why? Now I'll tell you this in a minute. As we read on, it said, these will make war with the Lamb, verse 14, and the Lamb is Jesus, and the Lamb will overcome them, for he is the Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are called, chosen, and faithful. Now, boy, that's a verse that preaches there. Called, chosen, faithful. I've done a sermon on that years ago. I haven't done it in a long time, but I ought to do that again. Called, what an outline. Called, chosen, faithful. That's a preacher's outline right there. It all starts, well, it doesn't all start with C's, 2 C's and an F, but called, chosen, and faithful. I can turn that faithful into the word committed. Called, chosen, and committed. That's a good outline right there. Then he said to me, the angel said to John, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. And so in verse 14, he says, this beast will make war with the Lamb. We found in Revelation 13 that there was a 3.5-year period where the beast that had the wound, which would be the Roman Empire, made war against the saints, the church, and overcame them. And if you remember in Revelation chapter 1, John writes the letter to the 7 churches of Asia, who he says in verse 9 of chapter 1, he says, they're brethren and fellow companions in the kingdom and the tribulation of Jesus Christ. So he's talking about the persecution, at least from my vantage point, he's talking about the persecution under Nero. And he's talking about the Roman Empire in 64 AD, officially began through Nero to persecute the church. It was the first Roman persecution, and it was the worst, except for maybe an emperor named Decius, who served as emperor, I think, around 250 AD. But it was the worst by far. Nero became the template or the example of persecution. I mean, everything goes back to how bad he was. This guy Nero was just bad. He was sick, what he did. Evil, incarnation of evil. And all the Roman persecutions went back to his precedent that he set. And the war against the Lamb is anytime you war against the church, you're warring against Jesus. And I would issue a warning to ISIS. They're making a war against Jesus. Remember when Stephen was being stoned, the first martyr? What happened? In Acts chapter 7, Stephen said, I see heaven opened. What is the book of Revelation about? The opening of heaven. Same thing's happening. Revelation is an expanded version of what happened to Stephen, who was the first martyr. And he says, I see Jesus, what? Standing at the right hand of God. Not seated. Every other time you see Jesus in heaven, he's seated at the right hand of God. He's standing because the stoning of Stephen was persecution against Jesus. That's why when Jesus appeared to Paul, he said, Paul, Paul, or Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? Because when you persecute the church, you're persecuting Jesus. And I would just encourage folks, you don't want to do that. Jesus is very patient. And for some reason, according to Revelation 6, 9 through 11, when the saints are under the altar, because that's where the blood was poured out of the sacrifice, under the altar, the saints are crying out, how long will it be before you avenge our blood? And God answers, he says, not very long, a little while, rest a little while longer, not a long time, a little while longer, till the number of saints who are going to die like you have been completed. In other words, God's saying, look, I'll allow my church to be persecuted for a season. I'll allow people to die. And I don't even totally understand this. Because if you're one of those people, from an earthly standpoint, it kind of stinks. Of course, when you get to heaven and you go in there, you're in all your glory, people say, look how committed you are to Jesus. I think you're going to see a little different, right? But nonetheless, from an earthly standpoint, he allows some of the suffering, but it's not very long before Jesus stands up. And that's why you see in Revelation 6:17, it says those who had been doing all this stuff are going to go into the mountains and say, fall on us and hide us from the wrath of the Lamb. Because what Revelation is really is a response to the suffering of God's people. And God's saying, hey, Look, I know you got it hard. Hang in there a little longer because my son Jesus is about to stand and pour out the wrath on these evil folks. And I would predict something's coming for ISIS. I don't know how long. I don't know when, but I think it'll be definitely in my lifetime. I don't expect this to last until I die. I expect God to do something through the nations. He's going to work something out because that's really what's happening in Revelation. You have the Jewish war against Rome. They rebel against Rome, and God uses that. He allows that to take place. He didn't even want it to happen, but it's going to bring total destruction to the Jewish nation, who, by the way, as I close tonight, if I have time, I'll show you, they're the persecutors of the church, at least at this point. And now Rome is entering the picture because a lot of history is taking place. So we have the mystery of the harlot. The harlot is Jerusalem. The beast is Rome. The 7 heads are its emperors and its first 10 leaders. We have the 7 heads are the first 7 Caesars. The beast's 10 horns are the first 10 Caesars. The mystery of the waters. The waters represents, it says right here, it tells us. It says, verse 15, the waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. Or the Roman Empire. The people of the Roman Empire. Now, it's interesting because I think it is McKinsey. Let me catch up in my notes. It's Chilton, David Chilton. David Chilton writes, Jerusalem could be truly portrayed as seated on many waters because of the great and pervasive influence the Jews had in all parts of the Roman Empire before the destruction of Jerusalem. See, we really need to learn our history because the Jewish nation had great power and influence in the Roman government. That's why the woman, Jerusalem, is seen riding the beast, because she was in cahoots with the Roman Empire to keep her status, her wealth, and her fortune. And that is historically verifiable. Their synagogues were in every city, and the extent of their colonization can be seen in the record of the day of Pentecost, which tells us that there were Jews staying in Jerusalem, devout men from every nation under heaven, Acts 2:5. Edersheim, Alfred Edersheim, in his book, Jesus, the Life and Times of Jesus Messiah, gives about 2 pages of notes on those verses. It's amazing. He tells you exactly where they're from and how it represents East and West. It's pretty amazing. The point I'm making is the Jews were throughout the whole nation, the whole Roman Empire, and it was the peoples of the Roman Empire that this woman sat on and got filthy rich. Now watch what it says in verse 16. It says, then the 10 horns, who are the 10 horns according to Pastor Bob? They're the first 10 emperors, or the kings that unite with Vespasian, or the future Roman Empire, which I don't believe it is, or a group of kings back then that were a coalition that joined with Vespasian. And once again, you'll have to pick and choose for yourself. It says, these horns, which you saw on the beast, these will hate the harlot. Who's the harlot? Make her desolate and naked, eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. What did Titus do to Jerusalem? He burned it to the ground. And what's interesting is that Leviticus 21:9 says, the daughter of any priest, if she profanes herself by playing the harlot, she profanes her father, she shall be burned with fire. See, Jerusalem was burned by fire. That's a fact. Whether he's referring that's or not, if the reference to that or interpretation of that is an interpretation, but we know for a fact that Jerusalem was burnt to the ground by Rome, the beast. For God has put it into their hearts to fulfill his purpose, to be of one mind and to give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God are fulfilled. And the woman whom you saw is the great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. Now, I mentioned last week that we think of the word king, we think of royalty, but in biblical days, kings were just wealthy, powerful people. That's why, Herod was considered a king. King Herod. But really, in the Roman administration, he wasn't a king. He was a puppet. He was under Roman authority. But he had the title king because he was powerful. Rome liked Herod. And they were, all this language and stuff, you kind of have to look at the history of the words and the context of history. And kings of the earth does not mean kings of the globe. It means kings of the land of Israel. The word earth is the Greek word gay, and it means, well, I was right on the board, but it's always a mess. It means land, earth. It can mean globe, but they didn't picture the globe like we do. They pictured the land, which was the land of Israel. Now, I want you to notice a couple things before we get into some questions tonight. I want you to turn to the book of Galatians chapter 4, and I want to show you a connection between the persecution of the church by the Jews, the New Jerusalem of Revelation, and then we're going to go to Hebrews and see the similar thing, because I want you to see that these concepts which I'm giving to you are right there in the writings of Paul. We turn to the book of Galatians, which is one of the earliest New Testament books written. The only earlier one might be the book of James. There's some debate over who wrote first, James or Paul. But Paul's writing about 49 to 50 AD. This is only 17 years or so after the death, resurrection of Jesus Christ. And he writes these words to the churches in Galatia because they're returning to the law of Moses. They're apostatizing from Christ. They're turning from Christ and the grace of the gospel back to the law of Moses and all the synagogue teachings and all the Pharisaical teachings. They're actually turning away and beginning to become legalistic. And Paul's writing his letter telling those guys, don't do that. And he writes these words. He says in verse 21, "Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not hear or not listen to the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons." Can anybody remember who they are? Ishmael and Isaac. The one by a bondwoman, which was the other of a free woman, which was Isaac. But he who was of the bondwoman, Hagar, Ishmael, was born according to the flesh. And he of the free woman through the promise. Isaac was a child of promise. God said, I'm going to give you a son. Which things are symbolic? For these are the two covenants. The old covenant, the law of Moses, and the new covenant, grace through Jesus Christ. That's the two covenants. The one from Mount Sinai, which is when Charlton Heston went up to the top and got the Ten Commandments. Okay? Which gives birth to bondage, which is Hagar. Okay? Now stay with me. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai. He's doing symbology, is he not? Is he really saying that the new covenant is Hagar, or the old covenant is Hagar? He's saying it's a symbol. Is not the book of Revelation a book of symbols and metaphors and images? It started way back early in the New Testament era. And he says it corresponds to Jerusalem, which is now. Now when Paul's writing, Jerusalem still exists. They're still offering sacrifices in the temple. They're still doing this stuff. He says the Jerusalem which is now and is in bondage with her children. But the Jerusalem which is above, the heavenly Jerusalem, is free, which is the mother of us all. This is Mount Zion. For it is written, this is from Isaiah, "Rejoice, O barren, you who do not bear, or you barren. Break forth and shout, for you who are not in labor. For the desolate has many more children than she who has a husband. Now we, brethren, as Isaac," talking about Christians, "we are the children as Isaac of promise. But he who was born according to the flesh," Hagar, Jerusalem, the old covenant, "then persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit. Even so it is now." When Paul's writing this, not this, I'm pointing this, pretend this is Paul. When Paul's writing Galatians, he's saying we're being persecuted now, not by Rome, but by Jerusalem. And I quoted numerous verses last week that just will, just amaze you of how many verses talks about persecution. He says, nevertheless, verse 30, what does the scripture say? cast out the bondwoman and her son. What does cast out mean? Does anybody remember a story? Send them away? That's what the word divorce means in the Bible. Abraham divorced Hagar. She was a second-class wife. Sending her away, that's what it meant to divorce somebody. You sent them away. Cast out, divorce her. For the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. I submit to you tonight that the scroll of Revelation, chapter 4 and 5, that is opened, is a divorce decree. That what's happening in the book of Revelation, in the harlot Jerusalem, who is represented by Hagar, Jerusalem the city, is being cast out. God is divorcing, and this is hard for people to take. He's divorcing the Israel of the flesh. He is not divorcing Israel. Because the church, which is the new Jerusalem from above, who's the mother of us all according to Paul, the new Jerusalem, the bride of Christ, is Jew and Gentile. And now God's saying, and then that's why we see in the fourth vision, as I said earlier, the result of the worship service is we have the marriage of the Lamb, the bride coming down from heaven, because now in a wedding, the last thing that they did was they got intimate with each other. And what the New Jerusalem's talking about is that God is intimate and in the presence of his bride. I don't have time to develop that fully tonight. I'm still working on that. But that is certainly what Paul was alluding to. And Revelation builds on this. Now turn to the book of Hebrews, which is a book that was written about the time that the book of Revelation was written, to a group of Jews who were apostatizing from Christ, turning back from Christ. Hebrews chapter 12, starting in verse 22. This may be, I can't prove this, but this may be the closest book written to the book of Revelation there is. Of course, some people think Matthew is, but Matthew, Hebrews, and Revelation were all written about the same time. Verse 22 of chapter 12. But you have come, this is after telling the church there to not return to the law. Don't forsake Christ, because they were being persecuted. And they were being persecuted by the Jews, not the Romans. Their houses were taken from them, lands were taken from them, they're thrown in jail. I mean, folks, you got to understand, this was a pretty rough time here in the 60s. You know, we had a pretty rough time in the 60s too. Anybody remember that? Peace, love. Make love, not war. You know, that's why I'm here. But this same context is in Revelation. He says, but you have come to Mount Zion and the city of the living God. Mount Zion being the New Jerusalem. Watch, because he's going to mention it. The heavenly Jerusalem. Hear the same language? To an innumerable company of angels. Do we see a lot of angels in Revelation? To the general assembly and church of the firstborn. Jesus has said in Revelation 1:5 to be the firstborn from the dead. Who are registered in heaven. Now, I haven't looked this up, but I'm guessing, and I'll correct this if I'm wrong, that this is referring to what the Levitical priests had to go through. They had to be registered in order to serve in the temple. To God, the judge of all, to the spirits of just men made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling, this is all temple referencing here, that speaks better things than that of Abel. Here's my point. The harlot is Jerusalem. God's bride, instead of being pure and holy, has corrupted herself. The Jerusalem of the flesh. And so the last thing in the worship service is this woman and the beast. Judgment's brought on them. And the result of that, because they're persecuting together the church of Jesus Christ and making war against the Lamb, and therefore God steps in and judges them by simply allowing them to kill themselves and each other. That's really what happens. They just kill each other. But the result of this, at the end of it, instead of it being something that hindered and stopped the church, will bring the church into greater intimacy and relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, there's a lot of theology surrounded around this, and I'm still trying to work it from people that I've heard. But that is the practical, basic message, I think, of the book of Revelation and this third vision. Now, next week, we're going to look at the actual destruction of the city of Babylon, which I think is Jerusalem, and I'm going to show you how it fits hand in glove, the city of Jerusalem. We go through it, and it's built off of the destruction of Tyre in Ezekiel chapters 26, 27, and 28. So if you want to read those chapters in Ezekiel, that's where it comes from in the Old Testament. Babylon, as we see, is I've already said, is the city of Jerusalem. Now, that was to kind of whet your appetite for next week to make sure you come back. Because after having too much sugar last week, I think we lost some people. You guys are hanging in there. Now, questions. We got a few minutes. That's all I wanted to get accomplished tonight. Questions on anything. Anything we covered tonight? Or anything that you've had questions on? The meaning of life?
There's a connection between Tyre and Jerusalem?
Tyre, yes, there's a connection between Tyre and Jerusalem in this respect. Tyre was the one city that helped, pagan city that helped King David build the temple. And Tyre is judged in the book of Ezekiel. And I'm trying to simplify this. Tyre was judged in the book of Ezekiel. And if you look at if you read those chapters and then read chapter 18 of Revelation, you're going to see they're very similar. And it's because the book of Revelation is to the New Testament what the book of Ezekiel is to the Old Testament. John heavily borrows one of David. I think it's David McKenzie has a whole page in his book or 2-3 pages, I think, of comparison between the book of Revelation and the book of Ezekiel because they're very similar, even in their structure. And so Tyre, John uses, or Jesus uses, Old Testament imagery. Remember the 4 things I said make up John's reference point? Old Testament, time of writing, apocalyptic literature, and temple worship. He uses the Old Testament story of the destruction of Tyre, applies it to Jerusalem, who uses the name Babylon. So he's mixing this imagery to convey the message that God's people have been corrupted through trade, and therefore their economy's going south. And we'll see that next week. And that imagery mixes. This is why, I'm reading a book right now called Shepherds After God's Own Heart, and the writer does an excellent job. He's really going to help me because he's got a whole chapter on how the Bible uses metaphors. That would be a worthy read for everybody, because what we do is we read the Bible from 21st century mindset. You have to go back to the metaphors they use, like shepherd. He says in his book, he says most people think of shepherding or pastoring as pastoral care. It has no biblical reference at all. Visiting the hospital and the needy has nothing to do with shepherding in the Bible. And he's right. And so what we do is we pigeonhole leaders and shepherds into this imagery of modern day that has nothing to do with what our jobs are. And he's exploring through the Bible this imagery of what does it mean to be a shepherd. He even talks about the book of Revelation, but I don't want to confuse you because he's got some neat stuff that I'm going to extrapolate, just little nuggets that are going to help me even my understanding of the book of Revelation. So that's what Tyre is about. Somebody else, any other question? Yes?
I have a question, just if you could explain chapter 17, verse 16 and 17, when it says, and the 10 horns which we saw in the beast, they hate the harlot. But then 17 says, for God put it into their hearts to fulfill his purpose. So it kind of sounds like God is a little, he's not controlling their free will, but he's
influencing.
having them do what he wants done.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, she's saying, in those verses, it says God has put it into their heart. This is a way of saying this is a judgment from the hand of God.
Why does he have someone else do it for him?
Because God works through human agencies. That's why we have leaders. Couldn't Jesus run the church without pastors? Probably do a lot better job. Couldn't Jesus run the government without people? But until Jesus returns, he uses human agency. Like the government, I tell people, people talk about civil disobedience. Ever hear of civil? And you know what they say? They say, that's an unjust law, I'm not going to obey it. Then they get arrested or fined and they complain. I said, well, read the Bible. Every time people in the Bible practice civil disobedience, they went to jail. Do you really want to be civil disobedient? Don't cop an attitude, because God uses governments. There's a role for governments. You see, there's a sovereignty of God. The sovereignty of God is that God is in charge. That means ultimately God's will supersedes everything. His will is not always done, because I can show you that in 1 Peter. His will is not always done. His purposes, I believe, always are. The question is, and some people say God's in control. I don't believe God's in control. That would mean if I smack you in the face, that means God did it. If he's in control, he's in charge. You know, ask John McTurnan. I'm in charge here. I'm in charge at Eagle's Nest. I am not in control. Right? John, do I control my employees? I never want to try to control them. I want to empower them. But I'm in charge. That means if an employee gets outside the boundaries that the organization, the church lays down, because I'm in charge, I'm empowered with authority to step in and correct it. But I don't control all their behavior. Likewise, God is in charge. This is my theology. It goes against some people's theology. I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. But I think God's in charge, and he influences, but there's certain purposes he's going to get done. The only question is, am I going to be partnering with him in those purposes and get the benefit, or am I going to be the other side and get the punishment?
It just seems, it's funny, I guess, or ironic that he uses the people who were persecuting his people to kill who were his people.
Does everybody hear that? It's because that's the book of Habakkuk. The book of Habakkuk sees a vision. God says, hey, I'm going to use, and I got to always get back in my history in my mind, the Chaldeans, the Babylonians. He's going to use the Babylonians, who are wicked. They're more wicked than Israel. He's going to use them to judge the Israelite. And Habakkuk says, wait a minute. He says, God, how can you do that? Those people are evil. You know why he does that? Because we have a relationship with God. When God spanks his own kids, he's expecting more out of his own kids than he's expecting out of the world. That's a fact. So he'll use an unrighteous nation like Babylon to judge his people for their sin. And that's what you have going on here. And that's the way God operates in the Old Testament. I know it's confusing, but it confused Habakkuk. He got mad at God, kind of said, God, you got to explain this to me.
I guess it's just like,
Habakkuk
if you
lost.
have that much influence, although they were already against each other, but you have that much influence, why influence to kill rather than influence that's better?
Because they repented not. If you look up the word repent, I don't remember how many times it's used, but like in chapter 9, after all these bad judgments, it says, and they repented not, they repented not, they repented not. Folks, this is not politically correct what I'm about to say. It is not popular in today's churches of feel-good entertainment churches. But I'm going to tell you anyway. God has a long fuse, but it does end. See, you have to understand, let's take the big picture. For 1,500 years, God has been working with these people, Israel. 1,500! That's a long fuse. They killed Jesus. Son of God stood right in front of them, in the flesh, and they kill him. He gives them 40 more years of signs and wonders to testify to who Jesus is and the resurrection. They still are persecuting him after 40 years. You know what God says? I've had enough. I've had enough. It's done. Judgment is set. And here's all judgment is, folks. All judgment is. This is the scariest, one of the top 10 scariest things in the Bible. All judgment is us getting the fruit of our decisions. God didn't have to do anything other than decree it.
Right, it just, the influence of him, it just
Seems harsh.
Yeah.
It seems harsh.
Maybe not. It just doesn't seem like the God I feel like I know.
Contextualize it with 1,500 years. How many times do you spank your kids? Don't answer that.
Never.
You punish your kids?
Yeah.
Put them in the corner? Put them in the room? Don't give them candy? Why do you do that? Do you not love them? You're a mean, sick little woman.
Some people might think so.
Who are you?
Yeah, I love him.
See, God loves his kids. What would you do if I came around your house and started smacking your kids around?
Yeah, and you get smack you harder.
You would. She works out. That's what's happening here. Don't miss the heart of God. He's given these people 1,500 years. And the Roman Empire, guys, we have myths about Rome. It was cruel. People talking about the good old days of Rome. It was cruel, man. It's like in the movie, you see somebody run over, you know, they do these movies and they said people run over them, they just don't pick them up. That's what the way Rome was. You just take your body and push you off the side. There was no, human life meant nothing. It was Christ who infused the world with a value for human life. It was Judaism. It was monotheism. When you study the history, if God had not dealt this harshly with Israel, monotheism would have died. Everything you read in the Bible and the Old Testament that seems harsh was necessary to even have monotheism, the belief in God and the belief in the value of life, for it to survive. Everything God did, he had to do. See, because on the big picture, God is merciful. We are messed up. We're the problem, but we judge God. How God's harsh, God's harsh, God's harsh. God's merciful. God wants to partner with us. He gives us free will. He lets us do things. He says, you want to join me? I'm begging you as a church. I could do everything right as a leader, and if you don't choose to follow what God's trying to do, you can miss out on what God wants for you. I've already seen it in my lifetime. God wants to do something great through this church. It's not about me. I'm just leading you there. I'm like Moses, leading you to the mountain, saying, God's saying, hey, you want to impact the world? You want to impact 100,000 people around the corner here? Do you want to make a mark? Do you want to leave a legacy in this community? You can do it. God's inviting you to do it. But I can't make you, and he won't. And how many times does God weep for the things that could have been, that aren't? I've determined, folks, I'm just made up my mind, whether this church follows me or not, God's going to have one person in this church at least. I hope you follow me. That's going to spend the rest of his life trying to impact that 15-mile radius, that 100,000, so God can have what he wants.
Who was the author of Shepherding After God's Own Heart?
I can't remember his first name, Liniak. I think it's Li, not L. It might be L-A, but it's called Shepherding After God's Heart. It's either Liniak or Liniak. I always learn the author's name last. I don't remember their names. If they're good, I do. It's like I read so many books and I say, oh, that's an author worth remembering. Great. I will say this. I will warn you. It's somewhat heady. It's a heady book. It's an intellectual book, but it's got good stuff in it. In other words, it's not a fun read. Anyone else? All right, I'll be here to answer personal questions. Thanks for coming. Next week, we're going to look at Revelation 18. We will get through Revelation 18. The following week, we will do Revelation 19 and the second coming of Christ. You do not want to miss that chapter, because I guarantee you, you're going to get some stuff you've never gotten before. Okay? Revelation 19. That's not next week, it's the following week. Okay? That's going to be interesting. God bless you.